for joining me today for a program that will focus on remote working, sometimes called teleworking or telecommuting, or the obvious working from home, and how to consider and address teleworking requests by employees, and then either decide whether you're going to allow or deny those requests in a way that helps employers reduce or avoid any associated legal risks to doing so, and also just some additional considerations that you might want to think about when evaluating teleworking requests. Employers have been facing increased requests by employees to telework, particularly within the last decade. Not to give away my age, but 20 or 30 years ago, when you had no laptops, no cell phones, no internet, let alone any wireless internet connections, these type of teleworking requests were extremely rare. And for many jobs, it just wouldn't have been possible at all to perform your job at home. But fast forward to the present day and the last several years pre-COVID, we'll get to that in a minute, there have been significant advances in technology with laptops and iPads, and internet and cloud-based storage and cell phones, et cetera, that have led to both increases in the number of jobs that are advertised as solely being teleworking jobs, such as remote medical records, data entry jobs, as well as increases in the potential for employees to be able to perform the essential functions of their job by teleworking. And based on the Americans with Disabilities Act disability discrimination claims that I have and that I continue to see and defend on behalf of employers, I've seen a dramatic increase in the number of employees who have at least the perception that they can effectively perform the essential functions of their job remotely. But remember, those are perceptions, and sometimes perceptions are not always reality. So not now, following the start of the COVID pandemic and subsequent to all the stay-at-home orders and mask wearing requirements and limits on number of people that can gather in a room or a place at one time, employers have been forced to completely rethink and frankly reimagine teleworking by employees in certain jobs to really enable their businesses to survive, and in make changes that a year ago would not have seemed possible to be able to continue their operations and continue working. So I've seen employers find creative and innovative ways to make teleworking work, but I've also seen instances when there are just certain jobs that can't be performed effectively remotely. And so, and then you have obviously the Americans with Disabilities Act and some of the legal laws that require or may require you to make certain exceptions to any general policies that you may have about teleworking. So today I'm going to cover 4 broad areas. Kind of first of all, how to effectively evaluate ADA and FMLA work at home telework requests to limit those legal risks now during the post-COVID or in the middle of COVID period, and then best practices when considering potentially non-ADA, non-FMLA working from home telework requests. We're going to then talk about telecommuting policies and what you may want to whether you want to have some type of policy regarding telecommuting, and then what goes into that policy. And then finally address some of the other legal risks that could be associated with teleworking, such as FLSA claims, particularly by non-exempt employees, disclosure of trade secrets and confidential information. If someone's working at home and someone's walking by their computer and sees somebody's personal health information, something like that, to breaches of privacy, regulatory, and other kind of legal risks that could be associated with allowing employees to telework. So first, let's talk about the ADA reasonable accommodation request to work at home and telework. So what are some of the best practices? And really, the process that an employer needs to go through when considering a telework ADA reasonable accommodation request is really not that different from other types of ADA reasonable accommodation evaluations. You want to go through, follow your kind of same processes for how you evaluate those requests, but then there's some other specific evaluations and considerations that I'm going to go through that you may or may not have already thought about. So it obviously would start with an employee making a request, saying that they need to telework from home because he or she has a medical condition that requires some change in the way the job's performed, and they think that they can best do that at home. And as everybody probably already knows, the ADA does not require the employee, to use magic words like ADA or reasonable accommodation when they're making that request. So the next step is, so the employee makes the request. The next step is for the employer and the employee to engage in what is called the ADA interactive process. And that's supposed to be a flexible, interactive process, between the employer and the employee, actively discussing whether you can make an accommodation work to allow the employee to work from home. So the first thing you need is the employer needs to understand why the disability might necessitate the individual to work at home. And the employee, on the flip side, needs to explain, what the limitations, from the disability make it difficult to do the job in the workplace, how the job could still be performed, from the employee's home, and basically say, I can do everything that I do at the office, but from home. So how do you kind of start that process? Well, it really typically starts with looking at a job description. If you have a written job description, that's the most helpful, is to literally sit down with the employee and walk through that job description and have a discussion about what, parts of that job description can be performed from home, and if there are any that can't be performed from home. If there's no written job description, then you would want to look at whether, then have a discussion. Like the employer says, this is what I think the essential functions of the job are. And then the employee on the flip side would say what they, felt like their job responsibilities were. And you'd be surprised sometimes they actually don't quite match up, and you have to work through those issues and get to an understanding of what really the essential functions of a person's job are. So, in this process, the employer needs to remember they don't ever have to remove an essential job function to allow the employee to work from home. They can expect and require the employee to perform all the essential functions of that job. What they can do, though, it may be required to do, is if there are some marginal functions, or there are some, small minor job duties that cannot be performed outside the workplace, taking out the trash or something like that, as simple as that, then there may be things that that small task could be removed from an employee's job description or job responsibilities, and then potentially reassigned to someone else, and then to make sure that you're not burdening other employees with a lot of additional responsibilities. Then you could flip and send and give some of the give another employee a minor job responsibility, but then take one of those responsibilities that other employee had that can be performed from home, and now require the employee working from home to do that responsibility. So you can kind of balance it out and make sure that the employer keeps workloads evenly distributed. Next, the employer and the employee would just look at the actual functions and see what can be performed at home, and whether the employer is allowed to consider whether if someone particularly is in a supervisory role, whether they can adequately supervise their employees remotely and not having those face-to-face interactions. Additionally, there are some jobs that require those face-to-face interactions, either with employees or with customers. They're a salesperson, they go out and meet potential customers, with vendors. So sometimes those types of responsibilities can't be performed at home. And then we'll get into in a little bit later whether those are, in the COVID times, whether that can be done by video now or Zoom. And then also whether, there may be certain duties that that would require certain equipment or tools that can't be replicated at home. For example, some essential duties that are essential jobs that really can't be performed remotely are, a food server at a restaurant. a grocery store cashier, a grocery store bagger. You can't remotely bag groceries from your house. A car mechanic who needs one of those lifts to lift the car up, to perform the mechanic work. That kind of thing obviously would not lend itself to teleworking or working from home. But there are also a lot of other jobs where the duties can be performed from home. So that's why you just have to look at each specific job and each specific job responsibilities and evaluate each one of those essential functions of those responsibilities and see if it can work in a teleworking situation. There may be, particularly for managers and supervisors, maybe they're allowed to, you evaluate the process and maybe they work, 2 days in the office so that they have those necessary face-to-face interactions and coordination with the subordinates that they supervise. And then 3 days, if they're writing reports or doing things that wouldn't necessarily require that kind of interaction, then those could be done remotely, teleworking. So again, it goes back to, you have to look at each individual job and what can be done from home and what really needs to be done, at the workplace. And then, some positions, for example, require employees to have immediate access to certain documents or other information that's only located at the workplace. For example, bank loan officer, may only need access to bank loan documents that really can't be or are not allowed to be removed from the bank premises. Again, that may be a situation where that bank loan officer, if they're reviewing those documents, they can't do it remotely, and that's not a teleworking opportunity. You don't want to deny a request, though, to work at home as a reasonable accommodation solely because the job does involve some contact or some coordination with other employees. Because like I mentioned earlier, you have to look at the job and whether meetings can be conducted effectively by telephone or by Zoom or Teams meetings or other video conferencing systems, and whether the information can be exchanged by email. And then, you exchange information by email, and then you have a Zoom call to discuss that information. So there are, creative ways that it can be done where you can have that contact and communication using the technology that is now available to us. Some other considerations is, would the employee be able to work, part-time at home and part-time in the workplace, like I kind of mentioned earlier, and would that meet both the employer and the employee's needs? And sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. And for example, if face-to-face meetings are required, every Tuesday because there are staff meetings or Monday morning meetings where the week is planned out, then the person may need to come to work on Mondays. And then if they're writing reports and reviewing documents the rest of the week, then maybe they can do that remotely, teleworking from home. Now, as part of that interactive process, the employer may request information about the individual's medical condition and ask questions for the employee to take to their doctor to help them determine, what may be an effective accommodation, and really kind of drill down to see if it's really something that can be accommodated from home, or if there's an alternative accommodation that an employer could potentially give an employee that maybe doesn't require the employee to work from home. For example, I had a situation where an employee had IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and they wanted to be able to work from home so that they had easy, quick access to a restroom. Well, the employer looked at their location on the job site and realized that there was an office right next to a bathroom facility that they could move that employee into, and so that employee would have easy access and quick access to that bathroom should they need it. And it was in somewhat of a more remote, private place, so it wasn't, she wasn't running to the bathroom every 5 seconds in front of a lot of her coworkers. And that was that we'd asked the doctor, we'd ask questions for her to take to her doctor, and her doctor said that would be a reasonable accommodation. So instead of letting the employee telework from home, we required her to come into the office, but then moved her office as an accommodation to allow her to be close to the restroom. So that's the kind of interactive process that can kind of help you work through these things. Then you have to also remember that, when I said before, sometimes employees' perceptions of teleworking, ignore reality. I had an employee that was a front desk receptionist, and she claimed that she could perform all her duties from home, and they could forward her calls or forward all the office's calls to her phone, and then she could disperse them, and transfer them as she needed to, and she could, they could send her the mail that she could then open and then return to the employer to distribute. But she ignored that she was actually a front desk person at a medical facility where she was taking patients' temperatures, she was giving paperwork, taking paperwork back from patients, escorting patients to doctors' examination rooms, all that kind of thing, which was a large portion of her job, as well as answering the telephone. And so, that in that situation, the employer's like, we cannot allow you to telework because that you'd be basically taking, 60 to 70% of your job, and you wouldn't be able to do that 60 or 70% of those essential functions. And that's, as we all know, not a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. But that hasn't stopped employees from asking. Let's see, in some situations that, to add COVID now into the mix, an employer who knows that an employee is teleworking because the person, for example, has COVID or symptoms associated with COVID and is in self-quarantine, one thing to be careful of is what should you tell other employees about that particular employee and their teleworking? Can you tell them just that they're teleworking and not say why? And the answer is yes, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to tell them, so-and-so is teleworking. If you need to reach them, here's how to contact them. You can contact them by email. Here's their telephone. But for the next couple of weeks, the employee will be teleworking. But do not disclose the reason why, because that could potentially get into ADA violations. So let's flip now to the FMLA and work from home and teleworking requests. Sometimes, an employee who's on intermittent FMLA leave and they, for example, have to go to cancer treatments and, 3 times a week in the mornings, and then they want to be able to telework from home the remaining parts of those days that they are not receiving treatment. And, the answer will depend on, a couple things. One, if there's a need for an ADA reasonable accommodation, you may need to analyze whether that employee has when they're not having those treatments, are they incapacitated or can they work? If they can work and they are not incapacitated by a serious health condition, then the ADA, may not apply, and the FMLA, would not apply. But if the employee, has some other thing going on, some other disability in addition to cancer or something that may require an ADA accommodation, you need to go through that regular ADA accommodation interactive process to see if it would be a reasonable accommodation for them to telecommute on those parts of the day when they're not receiving treatment that's where they would have FMLA coverage. But that's a little bit of a potentially unique situation. If, on the other hand, the employee is taking their mother to cancer treatments in the morning 3 days a week, and then they just want to, so it's not their own serious health condition, and they want to telework the afternoons of those days, that's really an evaluation of whether you're going to allow teleworking to a healthy, regular, employee, and that has nothing to do with an ADA or FMLA analysis. It's what's your telecommuting policy? When do you allow telecommuting? And you would go through an analysis of just your regular telecommuting policy without any ADA or FMLA considerations. And then, the other thing you want to consider is if you do have a general telework policy, you need to be careful about denying someone who's on intermittent FMLA leave the ability to telecommute when you allow other people, for example, in similar positions to that person, to telecommute on a regular basis or several days a week, because then you could potentially get into FMLA discrimination issues and legal risk associated with that. So then let's flip now to the non-ADA FMLA work at home telework requests. Number one, does an employer have to even have a telework program or policy? Well, the answer is no. The ADA and no other law requires an employer to have a telework program that would apply to all employees. But can you, if you want to? Yes, you can create a policy that would allow teleworking from home, and we'll go into the policy considerations in a second. But things you would want to evaluate is, again, back to, you do want to make sure that the employee, if you allow an employee to telework, that they can perform, all the functions of their job teleworking. And, and think about things like, do you want to require advanced authorization? Do you want to set limitations? Do you want to, you want to consider whether, okay, if I allow this employee or this department to telework, what about these other departments that are going to see other people teleworking and potentially be jealous of that or want those same things, but they either can or, maybe or maybe not be able to do the same thing based on their job responsibility. So it could create morale issues if you're allowing some employees, for example, all the exempt employees, they can all telework, but the non-exempt employees, you don't allow to telework. There may be some, potential morale issues. And then you have to always worry about when you do have, if you are going to allow non-ADA FMLA telework requests, are you inconsistent, or, is there any perceived inconsistency in your enforcement of, or you're doling out those opportunities? And obviously the legal risks will come if the more inconsistent your policy may be, or your enforcement, or your decisions about teleworking, if there are differences that, in someone's white and someone's black, or someone's over 40, someone's under 40, someone has a disability, someone doesn't, then you could potentially run into legal risks of discrimination. So then we want to turn to a telecommuting policy. So say you do decide as a company that you do want to offer that as a potential opportunity for some of your workers. If you're going to allow that kind of that policy, I would strongly recommend you have, or allow telecommuting, excuse me. I would rather you have a written policy that lays out expectations and standards and requirements for employees, so that the employees know what is involved if they want to telecommute, and who may be eligible and may not be eligible for telecommuting, and just so you have something in writing to fall back on if one telecommuting person or request is denied and another one's granted. You can point to a policy and say, this is the reason why. So that policy you would want if you have an employee manual or employee handbook, I would recommend it being included in that handbook, or there being a separate, or on your intranet, or some other, even a separate policy that's distributed, that's signed and dated by employees that they return regarding your telecommuting policy. So what do you want to consider in setting up those rules for all employees to be able to potentially telecommute, whether they're exempt or non-exempt, and you want to clearly outline the circumstances under which the company is going to allow individuals to work outside their assigned office locations or other work locations. So you'd want to clarify things like the telecommuting may be appropriate for some employees, but not for others. You would want in the policy that the company considers telecommuting to be a viable option, only when both the employee and the job itself are suited to the arrangement. You would want to kind of lay out that telecommuting arrangements are, the company would evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. Again, focusing first on the actual company's needs, business needs, and whether they grant that or not. In a policy, you would probably want to address if that it's not an entitlement or a company-wide benefit, and that it in no way changes the terms and the conditions of an employee's employment. You'd want to stress, for example, things that all company policies and rules would remain in effect and applicable to that employee if they're approved for and working from home. Just because you're at home doesn't mean you can start harassing people and engaging in inappropriate conduct. The company would also want to clarify that there may be situations where they can refuse to allow telecommuting, and that the policy and the opportunity to telecommute, that arrangement may be denied or may be stopped at any time if the company decides no longer to offer telecommuting. Some other subject areas that you would want to consider in having a policy is whether you want to require advanced authorization or approval, which I would absolutely want you to, I would suggest you have in there that you get the employee would have to get pre-approval, from appropriate management to be able to telecommute. You would want to outline, discuss schedules and clarify kind of when telecommuting would happen and when it wouldn't. You'd also want to set limitations, just so employees know that telecommuting, for example, is not acceptable if you're too sick to actually report to work on time, or you have other commitments at home that could distract you from your work. For example, in these COVID times, if you're taking care of your kids and you are really, you're saying you're telecommuting, but you're actually sitting next to your child while they're online, doing online learning with their school, then you're not actually working and available to work. That would not be, a appropriate telecommuting situation. It's not designed to be, in that same vein, telecommuting is not designed to be a replacement for appropriate childcare. You'd want something in your policy related to that. And that although an individual's employee schedule may be modified, to accommodate childcare needs, the focus you need to include in the policy is that the arrangement must be, something that where the employee can perform their job, and also meet the business's business demands. And then in addition to childcare, we also have to think of dependent care for your parents or elders, or other relatives. That again, telecommuting is not a substitute if you're actually caring for someone who's sick and not actually teleworking. Another kind of subject area that you would want to address in a telecommuting policy is recording time work and overtime work. That's particularly important to non-exempt employees that are on paid on an hourly basis and would have to be paid overtime for any time worked over 40 hours in a week, and which may vary depending on state laws. But you would want that set out and examine, frankly, when you're deciding whether you can allow a position to be telecommute or not. Is this a position that can be monitored, so that we can really, say they're doing data entry on the computer, we can see when they're actively on the computer and logged in, and we can see when they're not. That may help, an employer figure out whether there's appropriate monitoring to be able to figure out if an employee is really working or not working. But you would definitely want to have parameters and requirements about employees, particularly non-exempt employees, recording their time and including any potential overtime. You would want to have another subject about communication and availability, and what the expectations are if you're teleworking, to be able to be available to communicate with your fellow employees and managers. You would want to talk about security issues and company property, and kind of figure out what can be taken home and what can't be, and safety issues, and make sure that you would need to examine and have in your policy also some standards about the employees workplace, if they're telecommuting, it has to be just as safe as their office in the actual company location. A couple other things to consider is costs and kind of laying out for employees what the company is going to pay in terms of cost if they telecommute, and we'll provide pens and paper and a laptop, but we're not going to provide a big machine to allow you to put a car up so you can perform mechanic work. So that you would want to then have that kind of all laid out so that it's really well thought through, and employees know what is expected of them and know what some of the processes and requirements are, and that you as the employer have that clear in your head as well. And then finally, if you have that kind of policy, do you want to have the employee acknowledge that they've received, just like any handbook policy, that they've received that policy, that they acknowledge that they understand the policy, and they're committed to complying with that telecommuting policy. You would want that all affirmatively signed and dated by an employee if you decide to have that kind of policy. So I mentioned a little bit about the telecommuting risks, FLSA risks, the wage and hour risks. If it's always an employer's responsibility to be able to show what time an employee did or did not work, and so that can be challenging in a telecommuting situation where an employee is saying they worked 10 hours on a project, and did they really work that 10 hours, or did they not? And is that something that, if they're working on that kind of project that really can't be well monitored, maybe that's telecommuting is not an appropriate way to allow, or something for a company to allow in that situation. So you would want some, to look at ways that you could monitor and require employees to clock in and clock out. If there's electronic things, if they're working on computers, there's systems that can figure out if somebody's, if your system has been dormant for 5 hours and yet they say they're logged on but not working, but their actual job requires them to take steps constantly on the computer, then they may not actually be working. So you want to see if there are those kind of software monitoring things that you could put in place to be able to monitor those workers, as well as require the workers themselves to submit the time they worked, and say they decide one week that they do 30 hours of overtime, but they didn't follow your company policy on overtime and getting pre-approval for overtime. You would obviously want to pay them for that time, but then that may be a disciplinary issue if they're violating the pre-approval overtime policy. So it's more challenging for non-exempt employees, particularly in these COVID times. I think a lot of employers have seen that it is possible to have some non-exempt employees working from home. Again, but others, it's just really not feasible. And exempt employees, you would want to have, consider, can you measure exempt from wage and from overtime, FLSA overtime requirements, whether exempt employees, if you can properly manage them in a remote remote setting. So those are some of the kind of FLSA considerations, but then other considerations are about allowing teleworking is whether you can, what risks there are on, you let employees take documents home. Do those documents actually get back to the office? Again, can somebody, in the family members walk by and start reading the documents or see, information that could violate somebody's privacy? Those are all kinds of things that you would want to have policies and procedures in place to and discuss with the employees before they were to start teleworking, because you don't want to try and you want to limit those kind of breach of privacy and other type claims. Not to mention, you just don't want an employee to take, whether electronic or hard copy, all of your company's confidential, proprietary trade secrets and information. And then, while they're telecommuting, and then you fire them and they don't return that information, or that information gets distributed, and there's the employer hasn't really put in place any protections and ways to protect that, keep that information from getting out to others. So, and then finally, some potential regulatory and other risks if, personal health information. If an employee is a healthcare worker and they've got, people's personal health information, and it's not kept confidential, that can have legal ramifications. If there's, a bank, like I was talking before about bank loan officers, if they end up, taking loan documents home that has, again, personal health information or personal information, financial information, their social security numbers and things like that. Again, is that a violation of certain banking regulations? So whatever industry you're in, you need to look at that industry and look at the regulations and laws that govern that industry, and make sure if you're going to have a telecommuting policy that you address any of those potential risks to so that you can avoid legal claims with respect to telecommuting. Now I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that I received regarding telecommuting, and one is if there is an employee or is an employee entitled to an ADA accommodation to avoid exposing a family member who is at higher risk of severe illness from COVID due to an underlying medical condition. So the underlying medical condition is not of the employee, but is of the employee's family member. And actually, I've actually received this type of question very frequently in my practice, and the answer is no. That the ADA, although it does prohibit discrimination based on association, with an individual with a disability, that protection is really limited to harassment or to disparate treatment. It doesn't require the employer to accommodate an employee without a disability based on disability-related needs of that family member. So that's something that I've seen very many times with someone who has, a family member who has who's just gotten over cancer and has is susceptible or is immunosuppressed, and they don't want to, work at the office and risk exposure, to their family member. That is not a reasonable accommodation under the ADA and not required. Let's see, some of the, another question, and this is, again, with COVID related, if an employer grants teleworking to employees for the purposes of slowing down and stopping the spread of COVID in their office, when the employer reopens the workplace and asks all those employees to come back to work, does the employer have to grant telework requests as reasonable accommodations to every employee with a disability who wants to keep working from home? And the answer to that actually is no. You would not have to, if you were requiring everybody to come back to work, but you temporarily allowed, everybody to work from home, that you would not have to grant that, initially grant that request, but you would need to evaluate that individual and that person and just make sure that there is no separate requirement or situation that would warrant them to continue to work from home and telecommute as a reasonable accommodation. But the ADA and the EOC and a lot of these government agencies understand that in this COVID situation and in this pandemic, there have been situations where it's like, okay, get everybody home and everybody working remotely, but then once everybody comes back, and frankly, there have been employees who face or who got used to working at home and in their sweatpants and like that and didn't want to come back to the office, and the employers required them to have to come back, and again, unless there's some other ADA issue that really they need to separately evaluate, you can require employees to all come back. Let's see, another question. Do employers, including managers and supervisors who are teleworking because of COVID, how are they supposed to keep medical information of employees confidential while working remotely? And you know, the ADA, just because you work from home doesn't mean that you can just set aside all the ADA privacy and ADA requirements of confidentiality and privacy requirements. So you would want to make sure that you're, you know, for example, in an office that, you know, if you've got someone's health information on the desk or on a computer screen, that others in that you have the door closed, others in your family don't have access to see those documents. And you're required to keep those documents protected, just like, you know, frankly, just like if you were in the office. But you need to make sure that they're protected from family members and others, visitors, you know, to your home, because you know, it would be a potential violation of the ADA if that information was disclosed to others, or if someone, you know, walked by your desk and took somebody's, you know, medical file and started, you know, looking through it. That would obviously be a significant potential legal risk for an employer. Let's see, got another question here. If in a workplace where all the employees are required to telework during COVID, can the employer postpone discussing a request from an employee with a disability for an accommodation that will not be needed until he or she returns to the workplace when the mandatory telework ends? And the answer to that is not necessarily. You can go ahead, and even though at the moment everybody's working from home and you wouldn't have to evaluate that accommodation, you can still proceed and figure out if, go through the interactive process with the employee to see what their reasonable accommodation needs might be, and whether teleworking and continue teleworking, whether that would be a potential solution to, or a potential, reasonable accommodation in that case. So you don't have to necessarily wait until everybody gets back in the office to have that evaluation. You could go ahead and proactively do it, and then potentially even grant it. So it's set up and in place for when all the employees do come back to work. I think I've got one more here. If the employer has limited time available to discuss a potential ADA accommodation teleworking request during COVID, or frankly in any other busy company time, can the employer provide a temporary accommodation? And the answer would be yes, but you just need to make sure that it's very clear that it is just a temporary accommodation, and that you're gonna forego a true detailed interactive process. And for the moment, for the next, and I would make sure there's a time limit on it for the next, week or the next 2 weeks. I will allow you to work from home, but we're going to need to look at this, revisit this at the end of 2 weeks, so that it truly is a temporary situation, and you've got that. I would make sure that that's clear in writing, that it is a temporary situation, and that you would have to, that it would be reevaluated in a more in-depth way when, the whatever the pandemic or other or business crisis, when that goes away or is resolved. So I think those are some of the answers to the questions I received. I greatly appreciate you participating today. If there are any questions that I didn't ask or that you asked that I did not answer, please feel free to email me. I would be happy to answer any questions I can. And thank you, and have a great rest of your day.